Now, last week, the first ever Africa Climate Summit was held in Nairobi, Kenya, and we're going to be teasing out some of the key highlights and outcomes of the summit, especially with regards to renewed commitments. Chinan Dikwo, Vice Chair, African Energy Council, joins us virtually from Doha, Qatar. Chinan, it's good to have you on the program again. Can you tell us what were the key highlights and outcomes, especially with regards to commitments and initiatives to address climate change and also promote sustainability?
Absolutely, Will. Thanks so much for having me. So just to outline, this is the inaugural climate summit that's happening on the continent. In the past, much of the summits were the global ones, so the COP ones, which Africa would participate in. But for the very first time, Africa is hosting its own Africa Climate Summit to take a position. And you asked about the highlights. One of the big things that's come out of that is what we call the Nairobi Declaration. The Nairobi Declaration is the position paper, is Africa's position in terms of its climate position, and it's what's taking into all negotiations going forward. Now, many people recognize that the next couple of months is a very busy season for negotiation in terms of the climate, but also economics and all of that. So coming out of this, there was obviously very clearly the G20 summit. Africa had a united position because of this declaration. There was also the United Nations General Assembly that's happening next week. Again, the Nairobi Declaration and that paper would assist with that. There are annual general meetings for the World Bank, for IMF, all of these coming up and will allow Africa to have a very united position. Now, to the question, what's in that declaration? So in that declaration, Africa is saying very, very clearly that, one, we need funding for climate mitigation, for climate adaptation. And of course, it made several pledges around climate action and infrastructure and all of that as well. It was really, overall, a really successful summit. Some of the highlights, I'd say, so some of the things that happened, about 26 billion of total pledges of investment into climate funds. I think notably, the UAE gave about 4.5 billion of non-binding letter of intent, towards clean energy, about 450, again, from the UAE, 450 million from the UAE for carbon credits. Denmark gave about 250 million to the Green Climate Fund. The United States, Canada, Finland, Germany. I mean, many countries put a lot of money on the table. But the fundamental thing is, in the past, we've seen a lot of pledges, very little realization. So the hope is that this time around, it would be different.
But Chinan, just tell me, you talked about the Nairobi Declaration, yeah. So, but how does this declaration, with its focus on global carbon taxation, financial system reforms, we have debt relief, how does it contribute to Africa's position and strategy in the international climate negotiations, specifically in the context of the upcoming the COP28 that we're expecting, to happen?
That's a great question, Will. So just to lay this out, in the past, Africa didn't have a united position on here. Every country would go and negotiate on its own. Today, we have a united front. Africa has a united front doing that through the Nairobi Declaration. Now, what does that say? What does the declaration say? In the declaration, Africa has taken a very clear position with regards to what it wants and how it wants its climate investment, how it wants its climate projects to be funded. So there are key things there around debt relief, which we're seeing, so asking very clearly for debt relief. There are clear things around climate financing, how do you get that done? There are clear instruments in there around setting up carbon markets to help finance, the renewable energy systems that we're seeing in Africa. So to that point, the declaration brings a huge amount of clarity, and ahead of COP28 and the other ones I mentioned, like the United Nations General Assembly is happening next week, Africa would have a very united front when it sits across the table with all of the countries and it tries to negotiate clear positions around investment, solid minerals, and how all of those flow into the energy transition.
So can you elaborate more on the concerns raised by some of the groups at the summit? I know this is a big issue in terms of climate finance and the green growth at the summit. The risk of greenwashing with talk of commodification of Africa's natural resources. How are these concerns, how are they addressed at the summit?
So that's a great question. So, Will, you would know this really well. I mean, over the last few months, over the last few years, there's been a lot of talk, particularly from some of the East African states. Let's say sort of around Kenya, around the fact that the global financing system, the finance architecture of the world is a bit unkind and unfair to Africa. There have been all of those discussions. Now, ultimately, what that means here is that lots of these countries are calling for a complete overhaul of the entire system, asking that it has to be fair. Loan concessions have to be done in such a way that it makes sense and is kinder to the African continent. We don't have punitive interest rates as we've seen in the past. I mean, just to outline this here, actually, so many of the multilaterals that lend into Africa, the interest rates are about 8 times that of developed countries, which is completely unfair. So in the Nairobi Declaration, and some of the concerns that people have been saying, is around saying, well, hang on, we have to open up these concessions to make sure they're a lot more fair to African countries and not punitive.
Speaking of fair, well, what role did the private sector capital and innovative financial instruments play in these discussions at the summit? We do know that we need to catalyze investments, reduce debt burdens, and promote sustainability. How did private sector play a role in these discussions to enhance this sustainability?
Absolutely. So this has been a massive catalyst. So just to lay it out again, the summit had about 30,000 delegates. Over a period of 3 days, there were 20 heads of states, who attended, including the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Sorry, I'm going to answer your question, but I want to set the scene here, including the President of the EU. Now, to your point about private companies, there were 30,000 delegates, much of these coming from private institutions. And they participated in a lot of discussion and framing the overall position and question for Africa. They've also made a huge amount of commitments. So to give you an example, the Jeff Bezos Foundation, also put money on the table, and several small African funds also put money on the table, particularly around climate mitigation, climate adaptation, climate action, and infrastructure. And what we're starting to see, actually, mainly around Kenya, but also perhaps towards West Africa, around Nigeria, is we're starting to see small startups that are coming up with clever, innovative systems, ideas that allow for mitigation and adaptation in a big way. Now, lots of these need funding, and the work here is to try to match these startups with the required funding and to make that happen.
Thank you so much, Chinan Dikwa, Vice Chair, African Energy Council, for those insights. We do hope this is not just another talk shop, but more action we put in place to ensure this happens. Thank you so much for joining us on Business Incorporated.
Thank you.
Now,